two commanding officers tragically passed away within just 5 days of each other. One actor escaped a brutal Nazi concentration camp before ever stepping onto a film set. And one executive decision saw a beloved core cast member secretly fired simply because his face was deemed too ugly for American television. This is what really happened to the cast of UFO. Ed Bishop was driving to Pinewood Studios in 1969. His hair chemically bleached to a stark, unnatural blonde. The production insisted on an aggressive dye job rather than a wig, a chemical process that eventually thinned his hair permanently. He was the stoic Commander Ed Straker, carrying the absolute weight of a secret war for Earth's survival. Audiences saw an icy American military man who rarely showed emotion. In reality, Bishop was a warm-hearted Brooklyn native who had moved to England seeking classical stage work. He had already provided the voice for Captain Blue in Gerry Anderson's Captain Scarlet. But this was his physical breakthrough. Following the show's cancellation, Bishop struggled to escape the imposing shadow of his character. He landed minor roles in films like Diamonds Are Forever in 1971, but his distinct visual association with Straker made mainstream casting directors hesitate. He transitioned heavily into voice acting, portraying Philip Marlowe for BBC Radio throughout the 1970s and 1980s. He married 3 times and had 4 children. Later in life, he became an outspoken political activist, protesting the arms trade with a theatrical flair Straker would have dismissed. Ed Bishop died on June 8, 2005, at 72 years old, following complications from a viral infection. He remained fiercely protective of the series until the very end. Wanda Ventham stepped onto the set halfway through the production, wearing a silver uniform that would have overwhelmed a lesser performer. As Virginia Lake, she provided a sharp, authoritative presence, operating at the highest levels of a global defense network. Audiences saw an ice-cool commander projecting unwavering futuristic confidence. What nobody watching in 1970 could possibly know was that her most significant contribution to global pop culture was still a few years away, and it had nothing to do with television. She was already a highly established actress, having appeared in The Saint. When the series ended, she simply kept working, treating acting as a rigorous profession rather than a quest for stardom. She took recurring roles in Only Fools and Horses in the late 1980s and appeared in Doctor Who, demonstrating a striking versatility across British broadcasting. In 1976, she married actor Timothy Carlton. Together, they had a son who grew up watching his parents memorize scripts at the kitchen table. That son is Benedict Cumberbatch. Ventham spent decades quietly supporting his early theatrical ambitions, instilling the precise professional discipline she utilized on the Sci-Fi sets. In 2026, Wanda Ventham is 90 years old, occasionally making small cameos, including a brief spot alongside her son in Sherlock. Gabrielle Drake sat under the glaring studio lights in a silver spacesuit and a distinctive purple wig, perfectly embodying the emotionless efficiency required of Moonbase Commander Lieutenant Gay Ellis. Audiences saw a cool, detached tactician operating in the vacuum of space, a woman who rarely let personal sentiment interfere with her calculations. Away from the studio, Drake was carrying a profound emotional weight tethered to her fiercely talented, deeply troubled younger brother. While she was filming science fiction on a London soundstage, her brother Nick Drake was recording melancholic, commercial failure acoustic albums. In 1974, just years after the show wrapped, Nick died from an antidepressant overdose at age 26. The loss fundamentally altered the trajectory of her life. Gabrielle was a highly trained stage actress who left the series halfway through its run to return to the theater, a medium she fundamentally preferred over television. She secured a prominent role in the soap opera Crossroads in the late 1980s, but she spent the next 50 years acting as the meticulous guardian of her brother's estate. She cataloged his tapes, approved licensing deals, and slowly nurtured his posthumous rise from total obscurity to global musical icon. In 2026, Gabrielle Drake is 82 years old and continues to protect that work. She played a protector of Earth, but her real life was defined by fiercely protecting the memory of a boy who slipped away. It remains one of the most callous dismissals in television history. George Sewell played Colonel Alec Freeman, the pragmatic, deeply loyal second-in-command who served as the emotional anchor to Straker's cold logic. But halfway through the series, Freeman vanished completely. The reason wasn't a contract dispute or a career move. TV executives explicitly fired him because they decided his pockmarked, heavily textured face was too offensive for American viewers. The production team, embarrassed by the corporate cruelty, simply replaced him and never told Sewell the real reason to spare his feelings. On screen, Freeman was a seasoned intelligence officer leaning over the SHADO control desk. Off-screen, Sewell was a former merchant seaman, Royal Air Force recruit, and builder who had repaired bomb-damaged houses. He didn't even start acting until a chance pub encounter at age 35 led to an audition. He parlayed his rugged authenticity into a massive career, starring in police series like Special Branch and menacing Michael Caine in the 1971 crime classic Get Carter. On April 1, 2007, at 82 years old, George Sewell died after a battle with cancer. He was discarded for lacking traditional glamour, yet he built a legacy entirely on the raw reality of his unforgettable face. Dolores Mantez stepped into the command center with a quiet, undeniable gravitas as Lieutenant Nina Barry, eventually ascending to take command of Moonbase itself. Audiences saw a brilliant, unflappable tactician who never allowed panic to penetrate her console. Culturally, she was a quiet trailblazer, portraying one of the very few black women given a serious, non-stereotypical leadership role in 1970s British television. The brutal reality was that the entertainment industry was severely lacking in imagination for a woman of her immense talents. Mantez had actually started her career as a successful cabaret singer and appeared in shows like The Avengers, but she frequently found herself fighting against narrow casting limitations. When UFO ended, rather than continuing to battle a system that struggled to place her, she made a spectacularly decisive pivot. She quit acting entirely, abandoning the TV industry to become a highly successful businesswoman. She opened and ran a thriving fashion boutique, taking full control of her own destiny rather than waiting for directors to call. She married, raised a family, and built a legacy entirely divorced from her science fiction fame. Dolores Mantez died on November 30, 2012, at 76 years old. Vladek Sheybal commanded every scene with a softly menacing, heavily accented voice, portraying the unnervingly detached interrogator, Dr. Doug Jackson. Audiences saw a clinical, cold-blooded scientist who treated human trauma as mere data. What they were actually looking at was a man who had survived the absolute darkest horrors of the 20th century. Before stepping onto a film set, Sheybal was a teenager in Warsaw when the Nazis invaded Poland. He joined the underground resistance, fighting in the brutal Warsaw Uprising. He was captured, thrown into a concentration camp, and managed a desperate, terrifying escape. The icy calm he projected on television was not merely an acting technique. It was the residue of a man who had stared down actual death. He fled to England after the war, later teaching at RADA where his students included a young Anthony Hopkins. His distinct aura made him a highly sought-after character actor, leading to his role as the chess-playing strategist Kronstein in the 1963 James Bond film From Russia with Love. He never married and kept his devastating wartime experiences highly compartmentalized, focusing intensely on theater direction and painting in his later years. Vladek Sheybal died on October 16, 1992, at 69 years old from a ruptured aortic aneurysm. Michael Billington stepped out of a damaged interceptor craft, exuding the exact kind of aggressive, jaw-clenching charisma that defined leading men of the era. As Paul Foster, he was the show's action hero, a brash pilot who fought his way into the SHADO command structure. Audiences saw a man destined for massive global cinematic superstardom. The industry saw it too, placing him in one of the most agonizing near-miss scenarios in Hollywood history. During the 1970s and 1980s, Billington was screen-tested for the role of James Bond more times than any other actor in history, without ever getting the part. He was the permanent runner-up, always on standby for Roger Moore. He did manage to appear in 1977's The Spy Who Loved Me, but only briefly as a KGB agent who was swiftly killed in the pre-credits sequence. The frustration of being the perennial backup plan drove him to shift his focus, eventually moving to America to teach acting and write screenplays. He married privately and had one son, Michael Jr. The endless proximity to the Bond franchise seemed like a cruel tease, overshadowing a perfectly respectable television career. But the most chilling detail of his story happened at the very end. Michael Billington died on June 3, 2005, at 63 years old from cancer. Exactly 5 days later, his commander Ed Bishop also passed away. The two men who defended Earth together signed off for the final time in the exact same week. Antonia Ellis stood poised on the pristine Moonbase set, enveloped in the standard-issue silver spacesuit and striking purple wig, operating as Lieutenant Joan Harrington. Audiences saw a dedicated, unblinking operative who monitored the depths of space for incoming extraterrestrial threats, projecting the absolute detachment required to defend a planet. But the rigid, almost robotic posture she maintained for the cameras completely masked the kinetic energy of her actual background. Ellis was not fundamentally a stoic, dramatic actor. She was a highly trained, deeply expressive dancer and musical theater performer. Following her time staring at radar screens on UFO, she immediately pivoted back to her true passion, landing a prominent role in Ken Russell's flamboyant 1971 musical film The Boyfriend, starring alongside Twiggy. The transition from motionless sci-fi monitor to vibrant cinematic dancer was a whiplash career move that highlighted her immense versatility. However, like several of her co-stars, Ellis eventually tired of the grueling, unpredictable nature of the British entertainment industry. She quietly stepped away from acting to pursue a private life entirely removed from the relentless glare of the studio lights. In 2026, Antonia Ellis is 82 years old, having long ago traded the artificial vacuum of space for terrestrial peace. Georgina Moon was the youngest officer navigating the claustrophobic, utilitarian corridors of the Skydiver set, projecting intense operational focus as Lieutenant Sylvia Howell. Audiences saw a tightly wound, hyper-competent submarine technician who treated every blip on the sonar with life-or-death severity. Because she was only 20 years old when she took the role, her ability to project seasoned military discipline was genuinely impressive, but the grim, shadowy world of underwater alien defense was a complete inversion of her actual comedic instincts. Moon had zero interest in being a permanent sci-fi action star. She was fundamentally drawn to the loud, bawdy world of broad British comedy. Almost immediately after leaving, she threw herself into the exact opposite genre, becoming a frequent face in the legendary Carry On comedy film franchise and securing a starring role in the famously chaotic sitcom Up Pompeii. The woman who spent 1970 staring grimly at torpedo launch codes spent the rest of the decade delivering fast-paced innuendos and slapstick humor to massive audiences. She treated acting as an adventure rather than a solemn duty. In 2026, Georgina Moon is 75 years old, having left an indelible mark on two entirely contradictory pillars of British pop culture. She proved that the same face that defended humanity from utter annihilation could also be trusted to deliver the punchline. The men and women of SHADO defended a futuristic Earth that never actually arrived. But the very real, often painful lives they navigated away from the cameras remain far more compelling than any alien threat they ever faced.